The US dollar is the most powerful and recognizable currency in the world, but not everyone is happy about that. And many countries are in fact banding together to try to dethrone it. Trying to dethrone a currency may sound crazy, but with changing power dynamics, economic instability, and chaotic global events, America's enemies think they may have found a way to undermine its influence and steadily weaken the USA's reputation as a global financial power. The dollar, of course, still maintains its status as a world reserve currency and is a useful method of trade on the global market. Most economic experts agree that this isn't going to change anytime soon, since rivals to the dollar haven't yet appeared, or make up a far smaller percentage of international reserves. Even in 2023, with everything that happened, the US dollar was still involved in 89% of all the world's currency trading, followed by the Japanese yen and the UK pound sterling in a distant second and third. But the idea of a world reserve currency losing its status and dying off is not entirely far-fetched either. The dollar hasn't always been the world's reserve currency. In fact, that title previously belonged to the Dutch guilder and later the British pound. But guilder no longer exists, and the pound ceased to be a reserve after Britain was virtually bankrupted after fighting in 2 world wars and losing its status as an imperial power. So now enter BRICS. For those that have no idea, BRICS is an informal economic organization and bloc, originally composed of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, hence the acronym, but has recently expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and almost certainly Saudi Arabia, with these countries also being invited or having applied for membership. It was established as a way of challenging US and more generally Western hegemony on the global economy and trade. How they plan to do this is through a few ways, most notably through the role of the BRICS Bank, their own lending institution now known as the New Development Bank, and its potential for providing an alternative to the US dollar as the world reserve currency, competing with the US-friendly global banks like the World Bank and reducing the control of other global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, especially throughout the developing world. For example, up until now, developing nations could only take out debt in the form of US dollars from the IMF or the World Bank, under conditions that are generally less favorable to them, conditions that often render the debt as virtually unpayable. This is the kind of Western control over global financial institutions that BRICS members are looking to overturn. And this is all well and good, especially if you're from that part of the world. But let's be honest, Western economic initiatives haven't done enough to benefit many developing countries as was promised. They've in fact rather led to exploitation instead. But the question of whether or not BRICS will be the savior to all this isn't actually that simple. See, there's been a lot of talk about BRICS lately, a lot of fear-mongering as well as a lot of playing down. So let's look at what it actually is. First, we need to realize, while the BRICS train begins to pick up steam as we progress through the 2020s, it isn't this grand scheme plan that's been decades in the making to take over the world or something, as some sensationalized news articles claim. Even the very name BRICS itself began as just an acronym coined by Goldman Sachs chief economist Jim O'Neill in his influential 2001 paper titled Building Better Global BRICS. In it, he analyzed the enormous economic growth that these nations were said to experience and the implications that this would have for international politics and finance. The optimistic view of these nations' industrial policies, coming from an economist at a world-leading investment bank, was a clear indication of what Western financial institutions thought about the investment potential of these nations going forward. And it wasn't until 2010 when South Africa joined the bloc that the acronym was actualized. So, off the bat, there's a highly manufactured element to BRICS for these reasons. Even the former Greek Minister of Finance, Yanis Varoufakis, after asking Jim O'Neill personally why the S was included in the acronym, said O'Neill thought one BRIC simply wasn't catchy enough. In reality, the idea of BRICS basically started as a marketing campaign for leading financial institutions to focus their attention towards the cash cow that these nations could become. It may have been inevitable, but this initial coinage in O'Neill's paper essentially served as the momentum for the optimism surrounding these nations' first meeting in 2006, alongside the UN General Assembly, and the more formal meeting in 2009 that led to the creation of BRICS as an official organization. Now, most news about BRICS is regarding 2 of its main goals, the first being to replace the dollar, but it's not in the sense that many think. China won't be dropping the yuan for it, Russia won't stop using the ruble, and the South African rand will still be used nationwide. These currencies are going to keep being used within their borders. They aren't going to be uniting under one single currency. For BRICS, the intention is to create a common currency to be used when doing international trade with one another, so they can create an alternative to the dollar, not replace their national ones. If this sounds kinda impractical, using one currency in your country but another currency when trading between countries, it's actually quite common. That's part of what the dollar being called the world's reserve currency actually means. By doing this, their hope is that the natural order of global trade conducted primarily through the dollar will be overturned. And the more trade through BRICS currency, the less power the dollar has. eventually leading to a decline of its power. This may not be the traditional usurping of power that is war, but it's something that's even more calculated. That being said, if you'd like to see this type of war play out, well, let me introduce to you the sponsor of this video, War Thunder. This is easily the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, with more than 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships of 10 major nations to choose from, ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. This, along with the realistic graphics and authentic sound effects, will easily make you immersed in the intense combat of war. The best part is though that this game is available now for free on Xbox, PlayStation and PC. You don't even have to buy extra hardware to enjoy this game completely. Just your mouse and keyboard or controller is all that's needed. So join the worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today. So dive right into the incredible battles of War Thunder. There's simply no game better suited for fans of military history out there. So sign up using my link in the video description below. Anyways, if you look at this graph, you'll see that BRICS already accounted for a larger share of the world GDP in 2023 than the G7, which makes up the US, Canada, Japan, United Kingdom, Germany, France and Italy. And this is just showing the stats before their expansion of Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran and the UAE. Looking at it from after they joined, the expanded BRICS has increased their share to 36%. Meanwhile, they also now represent 45% of the world's population, while G7 represents less than 10%. By all means, things are going well for BRICS, but despite this, there's still major issues currently. The problem with this goal, and the reasons that some analysts aren't too worried about BRICS, is because of the inescapable reality of the dollar. See, the dollar being the world's reserve currency and the US being the strongest country on Earth are obviously intertwined. Therefore, reducing the dollar's influence is the best way to reduce the US's influence. But if you reduce the dollar's influence, then financial institutions globally that everyone depends on won't be able to function as a result of it. The best analogy I can think of for this is to imagine that the US dollar is like the main engine in a vast, interconnected global train system. The engine not only powers the largest train, but also supplies the necessary energy to various other trains on the network through interconnected tracks. You may want to try to replace the main engine, but you know if you do this, then not only may the largest train fail, but so can everything else, including you, so you can't. The reason for this is because there really is no good alternative yet, even taking into account BRICS. Let me explain. Ultimately, all currencies must be backed by something valuable. In the dollar's case, there's a few things. Originally, it was gold under the Bretton Woods system in 1944, after the US emerged as a global superpower in the aftermath of World War II. But this only worked for a bit until the dollar was uncoupled in 1971 due to insufficient US gold reserves and changed to a fiat currency system. Now it's backed by, well, to put simply, the faith and credit of the US government, which basically means the government's backing, the country's economic size and stability, and demand for the dollar. If the system of international trade functions through dollar transactions, it means the wealthy people all around the world would have a significant portion of their wealth in dollars. If you are a Saudi prince who owns an oil company, or a Chinese businessman who owns a steel manufacturing company, you will inevitably sell your products to the US, the world's largest importer. The goods will be purchased through US dollars, and you will then have a large sum of dollars at your disposal if not exchanged. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, there is a high demand for dollar-based assets and treasuries. So you'll go to the US to purchase real estate, invest in American companies, and buy US debt securities like treasuries. In turn, you recycle that dollar back into the American financial system. The more you do this, the more your wealth is held in American banks and financial institutions, and therefore you have an incentive to preserve the value of the US dollar. But in the case of BRICS, what exactly would it be backed by? Who guarantees it? The only country with an economy sufficient to do this is China. Trusting Brazil, Russia, or South Africa would be somewhat insane. Without being rude, they simply don't have the ability. If they want to back it with commodities like gold, does China or Russia want to risk hundreds of billions worth of gold to back the currency? Secondly, how do you persuade banks to hold it and people to trade in it? Currency trade is, today, highly efficient because liquidity is always available and transfers happen without issues. Which goes back to the first question. Which country would be willing to issue that amount of liquidity and hold the liability and be trusted to do so? Obviously, China is the only answer here. But the problem is that this wouldn't play out well. The Chinese government consistently manipulates their currency, often devaluing it to keep their exports cheap. And even though manipulation of the US dollar exists, it's nothing like the level of China. One of the main reasons the dollar even got adopted as the world reserve currency in the first place was because of how little the US manipulates it. For the most part, it's allowed to stand freely and have its value determined through the market. And a financial system based in large part on a BRICS currency seems unlikely as well. primarily because China would be unwilling to trade it freely, since it would limit their capacity to manipulate its valuation and influence export prices as they do now. It's a fundamental aspect of their economy, and if it goes the other way, the rest of the world is not going to want to use a currency that China can manipulate as they please, hence why the Chinese yuan is less than 3% of the world reserves right now. To put it simply, although countless countries hate the US and its close allies, they don't necessarily trust China either. Then there's the issue of the BRICS Bank and the framework of lending that it will operate through. As we stated earlier, the new development bank wants to lend money to developing nations that need capital through their own local currencies, unlike the IMF, which primarily lends through the US dollar. The problem though is that this BRICS Bank doesn't have the large reserves of all local currencies. It's not how the system works. In reality, what it has is reserves of dollars, or Chinese yuan. So if a country takes a loan from the new development bank, unless they plan on exclusively purchasing goods from states that share their currency or states that operate within the BRICS alliance, they won't be able to import from the US or European markets without dollars. This reduces the usefulness of the loan. So instead, the country that takes on the loan will receive dollars from the BRICS Bank, and in the future, they will repay that amount of dollars back in their local currency with interest. So basically, the dollar is unavoidable. Now, if their currency experiences inflation and is devalued by 10% when they have to repay the loan, say 5 years later when the payment is due, they'd still only have to pay the amount they initially received, which would be 10% less valuable now. For example, if Ethiopia receives a loan from the new development bank, they can pay back their loan in their local currency, birr, when it's due. If inflation causes the birr to be devalued by 10% during that period, which could happen due to the instability of national currencies in emerging market economies, they will essentially have to pay back 10% less to the bank, because the amount they originally received is 10% less valuable than it was initially. This is a negative interest rate for the bank. So who bears the brunt of these diminishing returns? Well, China does, because after decades of extensive exports to the US, China is the only nation in BRICS with large enough dollar reserves to facilitate this lending, so they can afford to take the hit. After all, they also have a larger goal at play here. But that's the thing too. China are sort of at the center of BRICS. China's easily the strongest member of BRICS, and if they're the ones propping everything up as well, then it's obvious that a BRICS-dominated financial system is one where China has more control. This is something that not even many BRICS members themselves would even want. See, this grouping of countries doesn't actually seem like a coalition either. Although united by developing economies with possibly the same common goal, these member countries, under different systems of government, aren't exactly on good terms with each other. I mean, China and India, for example, who've had territorial disputes for over 60 years along the Sino-Indian border, with skirmishes breaking out as recently as 2021, or the Ethiopia-Egypt dispute over the Grand Renaissance Dam being built on the Nile. And I don't even want to talk about the decades-long proxy warfare between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's not too hard to imagine conflict breaking out between several members at some point in the future. And even if it doesn't, the viability of an economic alliance spoiled by serious internal security conflicts isn't promising. At the very least, they need a unified front to take on the West. But the thing is, BRICS keeps expanding. And don't get me wrong, that's a necessity if they really do want to take on the West. But with expansion, it means that it becomes harder to reach a consensus, as we've seen with the EU. It wasn't so much of a problem with just the 5 original members, but as more get added, the more opportunity there is for politics and the chance that the future institutions turn into vehicles for competition between India and China rather than for cooperation, with each country trying to swing the votes their way. It's not like Brazil, India, and South Africa particularly hate the US either. They may even be collaborating with BRICS as a bargaining chip to leverage their position in relation to the US, playing both sides to get more out of their partnership than they were before. For these reasons, the ability of BRICS to make inroads against the dollar's hegemony is questionable, and it's important to remember this. That being said, BRICS is still a formidable threat just by its symbolic nature. See, the very fact that BRICS even exists mean that many countries are unhappy with the entrenched nature of the dollar in international trade and the reality of US geopolitical power through unparalleled leverage in the form of financial sanctions. Global financial and payment systems are increasingly being used as instruments of geopolitical contestation too. And yet, in today's world, these sanctions don't even work that well anymore. We've already seen a decline in the hegemony of the dollar following the imprudent sanctions that the US and EU placed on Russia, removing them from SWIFT, as well as the freezing of over $300 billion in sovereign Russian reserves held in the West. The sanctions that were placed as a response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the intention of disrupting the Russian economy, including their energy exports, which are typically traded through the US dollar, as is the norm. But the sanctions ended up having the opposite effect. Many nations like India and China remained indifferent to the Russia-Ukraine situation, because unlike Europe and the West, the geopolitical ramifications of that particular conflict are inconsequential for them in many respects. So they continued buying barrels of oil from Russia, but instead trading through the yuan or rupee. The takeaway here should be that the ability of BRICS members, especially China, to alleviate the effectiveness of US sanctions undermines US hegemony. The stronger these nations' economies become, the less the US can do to bully or nudge them to get in line. But even America's closest allies like France would like them to have less influence. Another inescapable reality, but this time to the US, is that times are changing. If you look at this graph done by Goldman Sachs in 2021, the weight of the global GDP will change insanely over the coming decades, with many nations classified as third world countries emerging as economic powerhouses. The times of the US's unrivaled dominance will soon be over, and they either need to accept what's happening and adapt, or potentially fall like countless empires have done before it. There's really two possible future scenarios in the world, and that is a world of the West versus the rest, or a multipolar world. In the West versus the rest, the division between the current Western countries and everyone else would possibly grow even more, with China trying to gather the rest under their leadership, with anti-Western propaganda to challenge the US global leadership. Meanwhile, the West, besides the US, would become increasingly weaker due to population decline and slower growth, as seen in the graph. The other option, the multipolar world, is where the US embraces the reality of the future, and if they want to maintain global leadership, they need to accept that these emerging economies will become powerhouses with time, and that there will be a shift in the world order. This is also what basically all BRICS nations would prefer to live in. If they do this, then maybe some of these emerging countries won't join BRICS and stay loyal to the US. But if they don't accept it, well, we can see rapidly growing countries that have declined to join BRICS, like Indonesia and Mexico, be pushed into their orbit. And that'd be a disaster for the dollar, because while it's most likely true that these emerging countries like Brazil and India would prefer a multipolar world, we can't say with 100% full confidence that this isn't a play for China to try establish themselves as leaders of a new unipolar world. What for sure must happen is that the US doesn't underestimate the potential of BRICS, and China especially if nothing changes. Look at it this way, Shanghai didn't even have skyscrapers until the 90s, and Chinese rail barely existed less than 2 decades ago. So why would anyone talk about China replacing the dollar? Until the mid-2010s, China was still widely discussed in terms that it would never have more than cheap, poor quality manufacturing, because people still thought that they hadn't paid attention to economic reforms in the past 2 decades. And yet now, China has a 23% larger economy than the USA measured in purchasing power parity. It's dominating technological research in 80% of critical tech and has the largest high-speed rail network in the world. Things can change rapidly in the 21st century, and the dollar may very well be no exception. Even if Western nations wanted to slow down this current trend, it may be too late. A potential counterbalance to BRICS' influence would be to pull India into the G7, making it the G8, given their particularly promising economic outlook and their regional tensions with China. But this is unlikely, given that from a historical perspective, border disputes are less important than beneficial economic relations, which India and China certainly have through BRICS. So in the end, BRICS isn't going to change the world today or tomorrow. But unlike 10 years ago when it was deemed a complete non-threat by most Western analysts, it is now a formidable foe encroaching on US hegemony at a rapid pace. But for the time being, the dollar is still king, even amongst the BRICS nations. But the longer that Western nations commit to alienating some countries, and the longer they prioritize outdated policy approaches over fresh strategies for this new economic landscape, the further the pendulum will swing towards the BRICS orbit. Thank you for watching.